Yeah,
So I'm
it's
always,
absolutely wrong.
extra fascinated when I get to talk to therapists who, have such a, much more kind of nuanced outlook in terms of of what this diagnosis even is. Because I feel like, the more I read about ADHD, the less I know and the less I understand.
Right.
It
Yes, it's
just
so
becomes so much,
confusing.
right? It's so interesting and so complicated, and there's just so much that we still don't know. And yeah, so but I want to hear your kind of personal diagnosis story first. You came to it through your child, right? Is that
I'm
how,
sorry.
or
No. So my diagnosis story is very interesting actually, because it's almost like I have two stories.
okay.
So one is I was actually basically diagnosed when I was like after my first year of college. So I was born and raised in El Salvador in Central America. So I'm not originally from the United States, and I just came here to go to college in 2009. But my academic experience was not great. And when I was in like middle school, like I was, just intrigued by a lot of things. And I knew that I want to study psychology. And I started seeing a psychologist, so like a therapist back home for a lot of different reasons. I was interested in the field, but there was a lot of stress in those transitions. And we did personality stuff, IQ stuff, basic, but nobody ever talked to me about ADHD. Nobody said, like, I would probably hear the fleeting words of maybe you're just not focusing, maybe you're just getting distracted. But nothing came of it. When I moved to college, it's like I lost all of my structure. And in the school years is very different. Like, yeah, I was not getting great grades because it was hard for me to study.
Mhm.
I would spend so much time like organizing how I was going to study as opposed to actually retaining information and all those things. And, after I graduated high school, hanging by a thread, of course, just kind of barely passing things. And, I did a year and a half of college when I was in El Salvador. Still, it was an American college because my goal was to transfer here to the States. And I had great grades because I didn't have to deal with tests anymore. So it was almost a 4.0 GPA because I was writing papers and I was actually had the opportunity to do things more that was, that were of interest to me. But the procrastination, oh my gosh, that was one of the biggest, I think, aspects. And now that I see it, is it was to the point of being painful, of waited the night before to pull all-nighters, then I'm sleep deprived because I needed to write this paper. And it was just, sure, I got a good grade, but then it's you suffered along the way,
Mhm.
and you can't relax knowing that you have that deadline, right? So it's if I start early, it's like no, it wasn't going to happen.
Right? That I think that's such a frustrating thing about procrastination,
Yeah,
especially in school, which was feeling like, could you even have done better had you started earlier? Like, I think the answer is
yeah,
often no, right? Like, I
yeah,
think it really
yeah.
is just sort of part of the whole process.
Oh, absolutely. And like you can't understand it. Like at that time, if I think of myself in those stages, like you just don't understand it.
Mm.
And all you hear, all these negative comments, it's, well, you just have so much potential, but I don't think you're applying yourself enough. I went through very tough experiences and when I was in school, and getting close to high school, because the school that I went to was actually it was very demanding. It was a private school. It was a German school. So, we had most of my classes were in German, then separate, I had like English and, just as separate classes. But math, physics, chemistry, all of those things were just terrible. I actually had to repeat eighth grade. I failed one of the classes and I had to repeat, and that was awful. It's like that shame starts to build up, from very early on, and feeling like, why is everybody doing well and I am not? And it's not that I'm not trying,
Right.
but
Right.
from the outside looking in, it looks like I probably am not trying and hard enough.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, maybe you should study more like this person, or maybe if you do this, or maybe if you do that. I'm like, none of it felt right to me. So it was by some miracle, I call it, I just was barely passing, and
Mhm.
I actually graduated from that school. But at the same time, one of the biggest pieces too, since I was like 6 years old, is that I was a competitive swimmer. So I was also an athlete, just a student athlete. And for, many years, since I was 6 years old, I learned how to swim. The next year I was part of one of the national clubs for swimming. I was competing. I was going out of the country for competitions, and I loved it. I absolutely love sports. Sports have been probably the common denominator in my life. And then I realized, like, holy crap, that was helping my hyperactivity.
Right.
That
Yeah.
was helping me focus in school to a certain point, before puberty, probably. And, nobody noticed some of those things. So I was not outwardly hyperactive. So I was one of those that you internalize everything, but you start noticing them, like skin picking, like those cuticles, like scabs, all those things. And when I got to the end of probably middle school, early high school, school got terrible. I couldn't keep up with both the swimming. I was training. I was going to practice from 4 to 6 or 5 to 7 in the evenings, and sometimes like three days a week. It was 5 in the morning to 6, and that was 6 days a week. My only rest day was Sundays, and I love swimming. And it was, just the aerobic exercise, everything about it, the competition aspect. And in school, of course, my best grade was PE. That was like my only good grade. It's like sports. I played soccer, I played basketball when I was, for a while in high school. It was like a big part of like the soccer team, all that stuff. And when I got to, I think it was 11th grade, the things got so tough. My parents actually got a letter from the school saying that I probably was not, performing well enough in school, that maybe they should consider taking me out of it. And that was a little rough. Like now, as an adult now, I think about it like that sucks. Like they basically were telling me that I was not good enough for their school
Yeah.
because of my grades. So it was like that choice of, I can be an athlete and I can be a good student in this school. Why is everyone else, achieving that? Or most people were on my team, for example. And I felt like I couldn't. And that was like heartbreaking. It's like one of those things that you grieve. So obviously my parents were encouraging, and it's like, well, obviously you're not going to quit school to swim. Maybe that's what I wanted to do. But I dropped swimming, and I was actually able to graduate high school. It was one of those things where I felt a little challenged. And it's like, you're telling me that I can't do it? Like, okay, well, watch me. I'll do
Right.
it. So yeah, I mean, I graduated and everything, but those years in college, like losing that structure, because nobody was expecting things from me, grades. Professors, the first years, like they don't care if you show up because they're just going to grade your exam and nothing. So it was, my GPA dropped significantly the first semester. It was a big university. I had a scholarship actually because I had good grades during the first year and a half that I did, and I lost the scholarship. My GPA was like below a 2 the first semester because it was so much. Being an international student in the States, I had very specific requirements to follow. So I had to be full time. I couldn't work outside of campus. So if I needed to make some money, like I had to work on campus, certain amount of hours. So every aspect of it, the social aspect was a big deal too. So after the first semester, I went back to visit my family every winter break, and I saw my old therapist, and she was like, well, here's a referral so you can go see a psychiatrist. And my mom took me, and I went to the psychiatrist office because, like, I'm not getting good grades, you're probably distracted, you're doing this. And I left his office with a prescription for Ritalin. So I filled out the questionnaire, like 6 questions, but he never said anything about ADHD. He's just like, well, here's a prescription for Ritalin, basically, and this is just going to help you focus and get good grades.
Wow. Okay.
And so I'm like, okay. And my mom was there. Like nobody said like, hey, this is how your brain works. You have
Mhm.
ADHD. This is what it means. You're having trouble focusing because of this or that. So of course, me not knowing at that time, he was like, here's a pill that's going to help you focus and study better and get good grades. I still procrastinated, so I would just take it when I had to pull an all-nighter to study.
Mhm. Yeah.
I didn't take it consistently because nobody said that that would also help me with my mood and the social aspect of things and emotions, which were so, we feel it so intensely. Didn't understand that part either. I took it for 6 months on and off, no consistency until I just didn't anymore. So graduated college, came to Iowa to do my master's degree in mental health counseling, which was a good experience. I was doing what I wanted, basically. Um, and even though the procrastination was still there, it's like that. I noticed it's like always rushing. I'm always doing things fast. I'm so impatient with myself, but not with other people. Chronic lateness to things and the time blindness and time management, those were awful to me because it's like, oh, I have time, or it's like there's never enough time.
Mhm.
So, just kind of like those little things, which were very external behaviors, were the things that just, made me curious. And doing my master's, I had the textbook knowledge of ADHD. So it's like, oh, I'll be damned. Look at that. I think I have ADHD. I'm very distracted by things and like I really can focus on the procrastination, but then I left it at that and never dug into the emotional dysregulation aspect. I never heard about rejection sensitive dysphoria or anything like that because it's not on the DSM,
Right.
and as clinicians, like, well, we look at the DSM, we look at this other things, and it's just, it was very interesting. And when I graduated, I had a job that was incredibly stressful, which it was still in my field and I loved it. I was a substance abuse counselor for several years. And I also worked as a therapist in that agency. And I loved the time with my clients and I loved my coworkers. I loved everything. But that job had copious amounts of paperwork. And that was basically my downfall. I absolutely hated the paperwork and the documentation and having to call attorneys, DHS workers, probation officers, insurance to do some of the, treatment reviews, all of those things. So all of those external sources, it was almost like invading my one-on-one with the clients because that's how it was. And because of my immigration status, like I couldn't switch jobs. So I felt very trapped. It was not
Mhm.
easy for me. They were sponsoring me. And I went to see a psychiatrist. Must have been like 4 years ago. And because I was depressed, I was feeling anxious. I was not exercising as much as I used to, but it was still part of it. But what I was experiencing too is I would just stare at the work that I had to do, the piles of paperwork, and I would just do nothing about it. That paralysis of, I know I have to do this. Like, oh my God, why am I not moving? Like, why are my hands not on my keyboard typing all of these things? And that would just push me over the edge of thinking that I was just not trying enough, even having a little bit of knowledge. And I was prescribed with fluoxetine and, something to help me sleep. Didn't respond well to those medications because after a few months, I realized I told my psychiatrist, I think, I'm sure I have ADHD, and I think I'm feeling very depressed and anxious because, I'm not feeling accomplished because I'm procrastinating. I can't focus on things. So I feel like this is the result of that, but I'm not 100% sure. So he told me like, yeah, absolutely, send you a referral. We're gonna refer you for testing. And at that time, that was 3 years ago or four, I couldn't do it because it was very expensive. I wasn't a, different plan. So I left it. And I also had a therapist and I told my therapist, about it, like, well, we can't change anything right now. So let's focus on, tolerating the discomfort of the job. But things escalated. I found an opportunity of one of my friends. She had moved to private practice where I'm at right now. And the owner of the practice and his wife, like they're incredibly nice. And he was actually in my shoes for many years with the international student. He's Peruvian and he's wonderful. And, he told me like, yes, we're going to help you. We're going to figure it out. So they were actually able to sponsor me and I transitioned to private practice. And that was absolutely life-changing to me, just to work in this setting that, oh my gosh, I can focus on my client. And the paperwork was probably like 10 or 20%. And the rest is just helping people, which is what I always wanted. And the different kinds of clients, I mean, my clients are high functioning, they're motivated to be in therapy, and when I started seeing more, I noticed I had a lot of clients that just came to me and they had ADHD. So helping with experience, some of them thought that they may had, or I started noticing some patterns. And one day with one of them, like we took like the iceberg out, and I've never like really dissected the ADHD iceberg. And I started seeing all those words that were different and thought like, oh my goodness, this is my life. Like this is my entire life right here. Choice paralysis, like the difficulty managing finances, losing my stuff all the time, because that was another thing. Just constantly lose my stuff. Couldn't find it, can't leave the house because like, oh, my phone, oh, this, my keys, my poor husband, I know he's just so patient with me. He just stands there and waits. But when things started to become very relatable to the stories I was hearing, I'm like, okay, this is hitting a different nerve. But I kept going. I was in the private practice setting for 2 months in my lovely office, and then the pandemic hit. So 2 months in my office, and then I had to go home pretty much full time.
Mm-hmm.
And that time was really tough because you have your own fears and anxieties about what's happening in the world. And now I was also carrying my clients' fears and anxieties along with mine. So I didn't have very much space, to actually allow myself to just like, how am I really feeling? I'm probably scared. Like, how am I going to help people if we're all feeling the same? And it started impacting my health a lot too. I have a thyroid disorder, so I experienced a lot of physical symptoms with it. It's been managed for years. But that year, I think it was a combination of the anxiety, like the stress of it, the change, that I just started seeing these repercussions on my health. And I started gaining weight, and my nutrition and my exercise are some things that I do to heart. I love that. I take care of myself very well in that aspect. And I was exercising, at least 4 or 5 times a week. And then I kept gaining weight. I'm like, what is happening? So I talked to my endocrinologist, and she, after, she's like, oh, you're probably, snacking too much, or you're probably doing this. Like, no, I think I know what I'm doing. I was like doing intermittent fasting. I tried doing a lot of things because I couldn't understand why I was gaining weight.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's like, well, let's recheck everything. They had to adjust my medications, but she prescribed phentermine to help me lose some of the weight. But I was like, well, I don't feel like I have a problem with like appetite, like that I want to eat all the time. But she prescribed it to me, and phentermine is a stimulant.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed like how much better I felt. And it was not just about the weight, but like my mood improved. And I wasn't feeling like, when I was bored, I didn't realize that was boredom, but it was that it's painful. It made me just shut down when I didn't want to do something. And I would just fall asleep. I felt so fatigued. And then the phentermine just kind of switched all of that. And I was like really surprised. I'm like, okay, well, I feel better. And I was exercising more. I was able to drop the weight. And, mid-year, I felt pretty good. I was running at least 3, 4 times a week, because running is one of my favorite things to do. And it made me feel really good. And then I went off the phentermine because you can only take it for a little while. It's not very good to take it long term. And I noticed a little bit of shift in my mood, but because I had gotten that booster run, and, that helped my mood in the morning, I felt so energized. So by the end of the year, I was training for a half marathon. where my husband and I were actually planning our little wedding too, because we got engaged at that time, mid-pandemic, perfect timing. But we were planning our wedding for November. So, I had that motivation. So it was extra. It's like, oh, I just want to look good in pictures and, running every day, got the half marathon. So something was challenging. Everything was just kind of like felt right. And, I didn't feel the need to pursue anything else until I got injured.
Mm-hmm.
I ran my half marathon, and that was March of this year. And it was great. The week after that, I got injured, and it was on my hip. It was like a stress fracture on my hip that I didn't realize it was that until, a couple months ago. But then that type of injury was just, I could not walk without limping. So then I quickly realized, like, I can't run. I can't run and I can't exercise the way that I usually do. And from that moment on, it was like I saw the decline.
The spiral. Yeah.
Oh my God, it was rough. That was really rough. I mean, it was rough on my husband because I was moody. Like I was overwhelmed with work, because throughout this year, in our field, like therapists, we've been in such high demand.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it got slow for a while, you get worried, but now it's like, oh my gosh. And I didn't have that outlet. And that was the one thing that I did for myself. Like nothing else. Like, yeah, I go to therapy, but I couldn't even walk my dog.
Yeah.
So I just like, I don't know. And around May, I talked to my psychiatrist again. I was like, I need to go do that testing. Like this is happening right now. Like I'm incredibly, depressed, like irritable, I'm anxious. I can focus. Like that stubbornness, like I don't want to do some of these things. And I felt very dysregulated. And, I saw how much it could impact our relationship too in our home. Like we don't have kids, it's just the two of us. And I just, it's just not fair. We were having, such a good time, all that stuff. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll send a referral again, no worries. And I was in a better place now, different insurance, all that stuff to go and actually get that done. And I went in May, and that's when I started my medication. It was like the beginning of June. Got through the testing, I was diagnosed with combined type ADHD, and, it's those 4-hour testings that were just like excruciatingly painful. But we had a vacation coming up too, which was, like I can't even walk, and we are very outdoorsy people, my husband and I, and we love hiking, we love all these things. And all I could do, I'm not going to be able to do those things. This is going to be horrible. And, I was in physical therapy for a while. Nobody could tell what was wrong. I waited 2 months for a freaking MRI, and until I was able to get it. And I think it was, what was it, like a beginning of August, I was able to get my MRI, and I saw a sports medicine doctor because my goal is like, I want to run. So it's like, you have a stress fracture on the femoral neck on your hip, and you have to be on crutches. And I left with crutches for like 5 weeks. He said, you're going to be on crutches. I was already taking medication at that time. And then the crutches were put in place. That was awful. It's like you're telling like a hyperactive person, and I do all this stuff so quick. It's like, oh, while my water bottle's filling up, I'm going to do this and do that. And like, I'm always walking fast and doing all these things. And then I get put on crutches, and I can even hold my cup of coffee, go into the kitchen, and coming back. I was already coming to the office to do some sessions. So I had to deal with the, parking and planning for the time. And that was not very great for me. I was planning for time, but not for time with me on crutches. So again, it was like another bump, and, we switched medications. I'm on Vyvanse now, and that just, it changed everything. And it was, it did help me, but that time was actually very stressful. And I still can't run to this day. And we're in October.
Yeah, it's so funny. The emotional dysregulation element is, I think, something that most of us come to our understanding of ADHD through the emotional dysregulation
Mm-hmm.
issue. Either it's the rumination, the rejection
Yeah.
sensitive dysphoria. I mean, those are the things that really like hit us on a deep-seated level, where
Oh
we
yeah.
really start to like look into what exactly is happening and what has been happening over the course of my life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's interesting, I talk about this a lot on the podcast, like how the sharing our lived experiences is how we really are coming to understand what
Mm-hmm.
this looks like, because the DSM offers so little
Right. Yeah.
right, in terms of understanding. And I'm like, why
Mm-hmm.
is there no emotional element in the
Yeah.
DSM? What is your theory? Like, because I feel like a lot of the emotional elements of ADHD come from are sort of like side effects of
Mm-hmm.
either a life undiagnosed, or just not understanding the source of a lot of the executive dysfunction and the emotional
Yeah.
dysregulation. Like, so much of that, it comes from just really not understanding it. So it's almost like a chicken egg thing with
Mm-hmm.
with the DSM, right? It's like, I
Yeah.
understand why they don't add in a lot of the emotional stuff, because um it's not necessarily the same with everybody, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, obviously some of us experience certain traits more or less based on our
Right.
environments, but like, why don't they put the emotional stuff in there? Because it's such a
Mm-hmm.
huge part of it.
Probably the biggest, you know,
Yeah.
probably the
Like,
biggest
are
thing.
they just like, I don't want to touch that. It's such
Yeah.
like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's so, because it's so hard to like really pull apart
Yeah.
and parse, all of that stuff, right? But I feel like the anger, the rage, you described it so well. I mean, I also used to run and injured my hip, and now I don't run
Oh,
anymore because I
yeah.
keep trying to. I keep like, my hip
Mm-hmm.
gets better and then I try and then it injures again. And so like, I'm
Yeah.
46, I've given up. I just walk as fast as I comfortably can.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a, like, brisk walking every morning is such a huge part of
Mm-hmm.
my day. And I feel like I credit it with so much of my emotional health.
Yeah.
And they're so intertwined. So when you talk about
Mm-hmm.
how like your life spirals and your mood
Yeah.
spirals when you are injured, like, I've really related to
Yeah.
that. And it made me think of like all the elite athletes with ADHD who then get
Yeah.
injured or have to retire, and like how,
Mm-hmm.
depression sets in.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing you brought up, which I hadn't really thought much about, or was just the degree to which mental health practitioners and therapists during the pandemic have like really had to carry so much of
Mm-hmm.
everybody's depression and anxiety from this
Right.
pandemic, right? It's not
Yeah.
just your own, but like you said, like, that was
Mm-hmm.
really poignant, where you were like, not only was I dealing with this pandemic, but then I
Right.
also had to kind of hold everything that
Mm-hmm.
and it just brought me back to that, the early months of just scrolling, that term doom scrolling,
Yes.
right,
Oh
of
my
just
God.
being like,
Yeah.
spending so much time just like hunched and tight, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, not uh feeling the chaos of it all, and feeling like
Right.
everything in our life had just kind of been thrown up in the air, and all the pieces were
Mm-hmm.
falling
Yeah.
where they may. um but
Yeah.
I it's been interesting for me to think about how like the H in ADHD, the hyperactive element, relates
Mm-hmm.
to that spiral, right? That
Right.
going from like 0 to 100 emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I kind of interpret that as the hyperactive element. For a lot of us
Yeah.
who never really thought about the physical hyperactivity,
Mm-hmm.
or never really related to it. And I feel like there is a lot of connection there between
Yeah.
how we go from, seemingly okay and level, to just
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my God, I see my whole life in front of me and it's a
Right.
shit show. And
Yeah.
like, right. And and then it's like, then you're just sort of in that uncontrollable rage, and everyone around you is like, what just happened? Like,
Yep.
you could switch like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I really appreciate how you just,
Yeah.
describe that in terms of the injury, because I relate to that so much. And
Yeah. Yeah. And
but
I've never experienced an injury like that, like this one before, like as an athlete, of course, I've gotten injured and it's overused injuries, but it just never kept me from doing the thing, bro. It just took a break from it. but maybe there were other things in place at that time as well. But this was definitely, that part. And you also go through this like waves, is almost like an existential identity crisis, which, is like a good point that I had in mind to bring up when you mentioned, how elite athletes are impacted by that as well. And then I realized that it was not only that, like sports and exercise for me have, like I mentioned, have been my constant and have absolutely helped me, kept me leveled and just in every aspect of my life. There were two things to that, because I always felt so sensitive, like so sensitive and almost fragile on the inside. Sports made me feel tough, so it's like, oh, I'm going to look tough on the outside,
Mhm.
I'm going to fit in tough. And, because that kind of covers how vulnerable and like how sensitive I really feel on the inside. But it's, the exercise helps the ADHD brain immensely, but then I also noticed how much my ADHD impacted my sports performance as an athlete for so many reasons. And the rejection sensitive dysphoria was a big one. I was a swimmer, like I was not a swimmer to the Olympic level, but, as in a national team, I actually was teammates with someone who actually made it to the Olympics at some point, and we used to swim together. And but it's the pressure, that you feel as an athlete, and that sometimes things are just not good enough. I remember
Mhm.
having a really tough coach, and that coach was, a lot of people were scared of him. And my dad liked him, and it was like at some point I told myself that I did too, but as an adult, like now, looking back and dissecting every aspect of my life, like no. And I remember how many times I actually cried, just with being in that environment, like with the athlete, the pressure. We had to go to competition sometimes, and we had to stay all together in one place. And I was just always like fearful of something, and I didn't understand what it was. And all I heard was like, well, just what we got to do. Like the coach was like very tough. And I remember I would cry, and I just didn't understand like what I needed. But then those experiences of like, well, you didn't meet your time. So even, I told my husband this experience of, my favorite style was butterfly, like what, like that was what I was best at. And I won like first place medal in like 100 meters, like at one competition. And I came like a smile to my coach, and he just completely dismissed it. And like, was kind of like, well, why are you smiling? Like your time didn't improve. And that was just like a
Mhm.
squashed. And I'm like, oh, so it was just like not good enough. And at the time, it was just, you probably just brush it off, like, okay. But then it's like, okay, you got to do more. You got to train more. What's the next thing? You don't, they don't allow the time to actually appreciate the success. But most of all, they give you that pat on the back, like, great job. You got this, you got that, which is great. But you rarely get how hard you're training, that validation of how much effort you're putting in.
Mhm.
Right? Like, hey, I do see that you've been training really hard. I do see that you've been practicing. What else do you think is going on? It was always the statement of like, well, maybe we got to do more. We got to switch this, or we got to switch that. And that was it. So then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me the more I understand about the ADHD brain and kind of
Mm-hmm.
how, in terms of our dopamine hits, like it makes sense to me why we're always upping the ante, right? Like I think about,
Mm-hmm.
like, I got injured, I continually re-injure myself because I can't help but up the ante. I can't help but
Mm-hmm.
always push myself. And then
Right.
I would push myself to the point that where I would get injured, where I'd be like, oh, I did,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I ran 5K today at this time. If I do the exact same time tomorrow, I'm a failure. Like there's nothing,
Right.
it's like you always have to do better. You always have to push yourself. And I think about, like, even with the podcast, like I reach
Mm-hmm.
these little milestones with the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't always get better, then
Mm-hmm.
it's the equivalent of failure in my head,
Right.
right? Like it's really difficult for us to kind of linger in accomplishments, because lingering in accomplishments is boring. It's what's the next thing? What's the next thing?
Yeah.
How can I push myself? And I think it's, I feel like I think about this a lot in terms of like our self-esteem, right? Like, of
Mm-hmm.
course, you're going to have terrible self-esteem if you can't appreciate what,
Yeah.
if you can't appreciate what you've done. Everything is in the past. Everything is like, oh, I did that. What else
Mm-hmm.
can I conquer? And while it
Right.
pushes us, and we're always finding new things, and I think it's one of our gifts is to
Mm-hmm.
always be pushing ourselves. I think there is
Mm-hmm.
that the other side of the coin, which is
Yeah.
no wonder we're so unhappy all the time, because we always kind of
Mm-hmm.
focus on that one bad review or the one
Yeah.
thing we did that,
Yeah. It's
and
like the
I
all or
wonder,
nothing.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's also intertwined in terms of this like importance of self-reliance, and
Mm-hmm.
feeling like you said early on, right? Like, I wasn't doing well, and it was not for lack of trying,
Right.
right? And so it was always figuring like, I have to figure this out. I have to figure out why everybody
Mm-hmm.
else is able to do this and I can't. And so
Right.
there's this, I think we grow up with this enormous emphasis on self-reliance,
Yeah.
and so why, having to need help when you're injured is difficult, or, asking
Right.
for help with anything is really
Oh,
difficult for
yeah.
us.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's so interconnected in terms of like how
Yeah.
all of these seemingly random issues that you kind of face in your life, like, all come back to this one type of brain.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like, the idea of like being injured and pushing yourself as an athlete totally makes
Mm-hmm.
sense to me through the ADHD lens, right?
Oh,
Because,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And we also do that in our careers. Like, it's not good
Yeah.
enough to be second best. Either you
Yeah.
have to be first or you're a failure.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, that can also get ingrained in you in the culture of
Mm-hmm.
competitive sports too, right? Like, I
Yeah.
don't think it's coming out of nowhere, but I think
No.
we're especially susceptible to that
Mm-hmm.
idea that like, if I am not always improving, then I'm a failure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's, the competitiveness, all that stuff, or the crippling fear of failure too. It gets exacerbated when you do the competitive sports, or, anything competitive, whether it's academic or anything else. And, for me, obviously academic was not my strong suit. So it was like the sports and, all of the combinations, like if you don't do this, like all or nothing, if I don't get the best time, like that, I fail.
Yeah.
And even so, okay, first place medal, big deal. And that you start to hear those messages, like it doesn't matter if this doesn't happen. But, in addition to that, being like an athlete and also being a female and a female swimmer, I mean, it was hard. Like once you start hitting puberty, like you have to deal with your monthly cycle, you have to deal with hormones. And when you're very little, I've heard like horrible stories of like, well, like, oh, my daughter can swim because she's not feeling well, she's having some cramps. And the reviewer like, so,
Yeah. Right.
you have to do it. And then the other aspect is the incredible strict diets because, you have to
Mm-hmm.
do some of these things. And I remember, and I was little, like between 8 to 10 years old, things like that. I remember getting these diets 2 weeks prior to a big competition. So 0 carbs, 0 sugars, 0 nothing, because we had to drop weight before the competition because we were going to carb up then. So we didn't want to be putting the extra weight. So that starts to mess with your body image too, which is
Mm-hmm.
already like the body dysmorphia is already a part, but it's, oh my God, I have to deal with this. And ADHD brain, strict diets, you're telling me what not to eat and what to eat. Like that was, of course it was not going to work very well.
Well, and not only that, but the perfectionism element too, right?
Yep.
Which is like, I have
Mm-hmm.
to do everything
Yeah.
110%. And when you bring
Yeah.
nutrition into that, it messes with
Oh,
you so
yes. It messes
much.
with you. I remember eating awful food, it was awful. And, my parents were always encouraging my dad, especially when it came to swimming. It's like, well, this is how it has to be and whatnot. And, you know, not only that, but I remember during practice during those times, they wouldn't even allow us to drink water because you had to dehydrate yourself. I've heard it from wrestlers. I've heard it from like, I'm cutting weight. I have to meet weight, you have to dehydrate yourself. So they would tell us like, nope, no water. don't do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like terrible. And I
Yeah.
remember having some practices that, I was so thirsty, I felt so dehydrated, and like even taking a swig of the pool water seemed attractive at that time. And it was, what you're supposed to do. Well, this is how it is, right? We
Yeah.
have to like run before practice, do all those things. But there were like several different things that, the criticism, that's why the RSD, there's one memory I have that I'll never forget. And I don't remember if I actually got late to practice one Saturday morning, and, my dad had to drive. I don't know if we fell behind, but it was 6 in the morning, like everybody finished practice, and then everybody left the pool, and the coach left me in the pool. And he told me to do 10 more laps. And that's like 10 more laps in an Olympic swimming pool. That's an extra 1,000 meters,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know why I was being punished, because like I wasn't sure what was going on. And to this day, I don't know what happened. But I kept coming back. It's like, no, keep going. And I was like, do another one. And I would come back and I would just go like this, like, why? And it was just, he would go like this, like, nope, go again. And I'm like, oh my God, like what is happening? And I remember crying as I was swimming. I was crying, like my goggles were filling up with tears. And I was only 8. My dad was just, sitting out there waiting for me until he let me out. I honestly don't remember, what he said, but I was like, why am I being punished right now?
Yeah.
So then the RSD with people pleasing, then you make sure that you want to be perfect to avoid that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to make sure that you do all the things, that you meet the time. So everything started to become not because, I wanted to be a good swimmer, but it was because it was pleasing my coach. It's like you want to perform at your best because you want to get that praise, or otherwise, because if you don't get that, then you get criticism,
Right.
and it hurts your self-esteem. Right. And aside from that, those two aspects like can really impact, you think that may not be the sport for you, but it ended up being like it's just the environment. But I
Mm-hmm.
forgot how much I love swimming because of the emotions and everything that I was going through, because of the other aspects of it were, I was always scared and anxious before a competition, like, oh my gosh, what if I miss my hit? What if I miss this? And then, what are going to be the consequences? Another aspect I didn't think about was the sensory stuff,
I know, right? That
the
has just
sensory
been mind blowing
overload.
to me. I had
Yep.
I would never have
Yep.
said I had sensory issues until I was
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed and really started looking into
Yep.
that connection. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I have
Yeah.
so many. Where do I even begin?
Yep, the sensory stuff. And as an athlete, you deal with that. If you're
Yeah.
in a competition, like I vividly remember, when they tell you to go and you get ready on your lane, you're just kind of stretching. But then what I remember is like the noise of the crowds, crowds, like parents yelling, all of that stuff, like coaches on this side, athletes on that side. And and then as I'm walking, I'm like having all these thoughts like, oh my gosh, what if I slip when I'm in in that starting block? Like, what if I slip? What if I just go before like the gunshot or the little beep, rings and all that stuff? But then I remember that the thing that calmed me down was like looking at the water. And I
Mhm.
was walking, and so I was tuning out those sensory stuff. But at the same time, like you feel nervous, and sometimes that gets in the way as you're swimming, and you may not perform at your best if something is past the level of tolerance that you can't cope with. But I remember as a little kid thinking like, oh, the pool looks like Jello. It's very still. The water looks still, and I would just stare at it. Blue is my favorite color, so it was just calming in a way. But I didn't realize how much of the sensory stuff can impact that well.
Interesting.
And I cannot even imagine Olympic athletes dealing with all the crowds and
Yeah.
also criticism.
Well, and not only that, but I think also like the difficulty with rest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that also comes back to that idea of like believing that you could always be trying harder, right? Because we
Yep.
also kind of really don't understand. I think the concept of trying and outcome are very skewed for us, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's not a simple relationship. Sometimes things
Yeah.
come super easy to us, and sometimes things come incredibly difficult to us. So we've never really had a
Mm-hmm.
very like reliable concept of trying, right? And so I think it
Right.
really, that affects how we rest, or how we
Mm-hmm.
can't rest, right? Because
Yeah.
there's always that sense of, I could be doing more, I could be using this time more productively, I could be doing this.
Yeah.
And why so many of us, I think, feel like we default into like, I'm lazy if I'm
Yeah.
resting,
Yeah.
and what is wrong with me,
And not being productive.
yeah, right.
It's, yeah. I never noticed to this day. It's like the realization of, holy shit, like I have never been able to relax in my
Oh
life.
yeah, same.
And it's like, because even if you're sitting, like my husband and I can be watching a movie or something, like either I'm like rocking in my chair, like, or I have my phone. But even if I'm by myself, the guilt starts creeping in, because ADHD comes with a very lovely side of guilt and shame, obviously, especially if you get diagnosed as an adult. But it's like, I could be doing something more. I could clean. And then it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I should clean the dishes. I should clean this, do that. And then it's like choice paralysis. And then you don't do anything. And then you feel
Right.
lazy. Right.
I
So,
know. I know when I was first diagnosed, I would talk about like how I'm so much kinder to myself when it comes to
mm-hmm,
rest, because now I think of it as like I'm recharging because I was hyper focusing, but I'm not kinder to myself. Like now I'm just like, I realize that I'm recharging, but I also still am impatient, right? So I'm like,
right.
okay, you should be done by now. You should be back to doing something, like I don't feel
Mm-hmm.
like I'm necessarily kinder to myself in a lot of those
It's
regards,
hard.
even though I know what's happening.
Yeah.
Because yeah, there is still that sense of like, I should be able to, I should be able, if most people need 8 hours sleep, I should be able to get by on 6. What's wrong with
Mm-hmm.
me if I'm not better than everybody else in
Right.
random elements of life, right?
Yep, exactly. And it's, the sleep problems were a huge thing. So even when you think about your life from this lens, like it's everything, you
Everything.
know, every single thing and experience that I can ever imagine. Like ADHD is just like, oh my gosh, that's what it was.
Well, this is why I
From,
get so frustrated when there's
yeah.
that response like, maybe, be careful. You might
Mm-hmm.
feel like ADHD is the answer to everything, but you should really
Mm-hmm.
like, get officially diagnosed because it could be something else. And that's what always
Mm-hmm.
trips me up, because I'm
Yeah.
like, what else could it be? Like, I just feel like it's so, everything is wrapped up in this, right? And so like when
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, what exactly do you mean it could be something else? Like, what is the difference between somebody who has ADHD and feels in their bones like this is
Mm-hmm.
it, right? This is describing and
Yeah.
putting this, new lens on so many aspects of my life. And then hearing like, well, maybe it's just anxiety, or maybe it's just trauma related,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I feel like for those of us who have ADHD, that doubt that's always there is
Mm-hmm.
makes the diagnosis journey that much more difficult. And
Right. Yeah.
that's what I find. That's when I say, like, when I say things like the more I learn, the less I know, it's that same
Yeah.
sense of like, what exactly is happening,
Yeah.
with ADHD, and like, because I'm always thinking, well, maybe it's not, maybe I don't have ADHD, maybe it's just something else, maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's this. um
Yeah.
and then I just tell myself that's all part of having
Yeah.
ADHD.
Yeah. Like you gaslight yourself
Right,
and,
yeah.
you
and
minimize things.
and all of that internalized stigma, right? Like,
Yeah.
even, so I think, uh, I don't know what the answer is, but maybe a lot more people have ADHD than we think, or, maybe this is just sort
Mm-hmm.
of, we're going through a mental health revolution right now, and more people are
Right.
are understanding what it looks like, especially
Yeah.
in adults. But it just seems
Oh,
to
yeah.
me like, um it just seems to me like there are so many of us who are experiencing this,
Mm-hmm.
and are
And
coming to this
mhm.
diagnosis. and
Yeah.
and I don't know, what do you think? Do you feel like there's been a proliferation of ADHD diagnoses since the pandemic, or even?
I think it definitely has, just because when you think about it, like everything that you're used to changes abruptly for a lot of people,
Yeah.
So I, admire moms, and women who had to be at home with their kiddos, and maybe they didn't have enough space and they had to work from home, like both parents from home with kids. And then you think of the sensory issues, like all of those things combine under the same roof. So there's definitely, the pandemic has shown a lot of things, whether it's ADHD or not, but it was like the pusher of a lot of like, hey, you haven't been dealing with this sort of
Right.
deal,
I know. Sometimes I look around and I'm like, is anyone not struggling right now?
Right, right. It's
Uh,
I've seen a lot of adults who got diagnosed with autism too, like later in life. And
yeah.
so it's the neurodivergent community is there's so many aspects to it, but definitely that was, as adults, it comes with layers and layers of complications, which is why you have to be very thorough. But with ADHD, like I'm an ADHD certified clinical services provider. Like I actually decided to get that certification because I had a lot of clients who were, and it's, you have to look for it as a clinician. It's one of those things that, if it's not like we can rule it out, but it's not a mental issue. This is a brain disorder, and it, in the world of psychiatry, it's probably the most manageable and treatable of all conditions,
Mhm.
because you can actually see like our brain structures are different, the way that it functions is different, even if each person's experience of it is a little bit different, but sometimes we have to look for it because it's a chemical imbalance. A lot of like personality disorders, because women tend to get diagnosed with personality disorders, and that's with thinking patterns. It may present that way, but now as a clinician and I see people, it's almost like you have this imaginary checkbox when people talk about their impulsivity, maybe unhealthy relationships, eating disorders, because it's so connected to that, the perfectionism, so I tend to ask like questions a certain way that will allow me to see. And then if I start noticing, like, has anybody talked to you about ADHD? Like, let's explore that a little bit, and we'll educate, and I'll send referrals to the places if it's something that we want to explore. And definitely, I had my clients with ADHD, but also so many that after some months and really like, oh my goodness, like let's explore this, and it was
Mhm.
actually ADHD. Because it's like,
Right.
oh, I can't follow like a workout program. Like I always get bored. Like I got a bike, I didn't use it. And it's the hyperfixations that you don't think about. And then you feel like a failure for not sticking to it.
Yeah. And
And
then, yeah. And then I hear so many stories of women who have, had all of these issues, have done their research, really kind
mhm.
of feel like it's got to be ADHD. And then they go to a doctor and the doctor's like, no, I don't think you have ADHD.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've
And
heard
like how,
stories.
right. And how crushing that is. And I'm like, so as an expert, do you ever have somebody come to you who thinks they have ADHD and you think, no, they don't?
No, I don't. I'm not very quick to say no, you don't. Sometimes if I just met them,
Mhm.
and I would just ask them, what makes you think you have ADHD?
Right. Yeah. Cause
Let's talk about it.
right. I
Mhm.
feel like by the time you get to the point where you're like, holy crap, I think I have ADHD, that seems to me
Mhm.
like that's pretty much an indicator.
It's a
Like
fear.
I don't think
Yeah.
a lot of people misdiagnose themselves. And I'm not basing that on
Yeah.
nothing other than,
Mhm.
the people I've met who, it's almost like when the more you know about ADHD, the more you can kind of pick somebody out of a crowd and be like,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, you have it.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
There
I
are
don't meet a lot of,
determining factors for sure,
right. Yeah.
and because a lot of things can change your brain structure. Trauma can change your brain structure. I also work with a lot of people. I'm a certified clinical trauma provider as well. So I see a lot of people with PTSD, and complex trauma can change your brain structure and at the same time impact you. And you can concentrate, there's people pleasing, there's all of these behaviors that are very consistent, with ADHD, but then there's going to be some determining factors that will allow me to see like, no, this is not it for this person. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it has to do with, the executive function part of maybe working memory, or just the task initiation, having no problems, just doing things,
Mm-hmm.
or the comments. Like, I just don't understand, why this person just do it. If you want to do it, just do it.
Yeah.
And they're able to do that. So you have to be very, very thorough. It's, if I do an evaluation, I want to explore every aspect, rule out medical things first. That's always my thing as a therapist, like evaluate, like let's rule out medical conditions, because even for women, especially if we're dealing with a lot of hormone problems, the symptoms are going to present very similarly to ADHD, so talk to doctors, let's rule out thyroid disorders, anything with the endocrine system can have a lot of, symptoms that will present as psychological or something like that. And so you have to rule those things out and be mindful of it. But,
Yeah.
it's, you can't dismiss someone too quickly. And that's my knowledge as a therapist, of course, but people in the medical field, they don't have the same approach. So they tend to be very quick to dismiss someone like, well, but you're an adult. Like, why? You did great in school. Why do you think you have ADHD? And it's like, yeah, because that's what it is. Good grades,
Right. Or say to a college student, here, take this Ritalin. It'll help you. And like not bother to really talk
Exactly.
about what's happening
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. And I can say very much about that because I know it's, my country, like back then, there's not that much knowledge about mental health, to that extent. Obviously, we have providers, but especially ADHD. My parents and I had no clue, right? Like, how could we know? And it's genetic. Like, in this year, I learned like it's definitely coming from my dad, and him and I have chat about it. But even my dad was a person who just didn't acknowledge that or believed in that, at the beginning until we were able to actually have a good chat. But you just, if you don't know, you can do, and
Right. And I know, I feel like I spend a lot of time with my own children feeling like, what do I not know? What am I not seeing?
mm-hmm.
Because I feel like so much of this, so much of the grief of an adult diagnosis is looking back at all of those signs that were
Oh yeah.
there all along that nobody spotted, right? Because we didn't know. I mean, I
Yeah,
can't
you
I
never
can't
know.
be angry at my parents or my
Yeah,
teachers, but at the same time, like that,
yeah,
it does feel like, gosh, how would my life have been different?
yeah, definitely. It's a very deep grief. It's very different than anything because it's, yeah, you have to go through what could have been, and where would I be right now? But then you shift into the identity crisis, like, oh my gosh, have I just been doing things because all of this was expected of me and not because it's what I wanted, like that, adapting to different people. It's like fitting in, but then you forget about who you truly are,
Yeah.
since you don't feel like you belong, it's, you have to act accordingly. And that was my thing. I felt like such an outsider, and my passion was helping people, my deep sense of empathy. But why I wanted to study what I did basically was because I wanted to understand people more. I came to that realization lately. It's like I wanted to know like why people did the things that they did, because some things just didn't make sense to me.
Right.
Yeah, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like therapist is kind of a perfect um uh career for somebody with ADHD, right? Because we really
Mhm.
are like puzzle solvers and we really want to know the
Mhm.
why
Oh
behind
yeah.
everything. And
Mhm.
and we're verbal processing, I think for me, like
Oh
I
yeah.
I feel like that's how I learn anything, is by like talking out loud, or you know when
Mhm.
talking to my husband about that, like that idea of like I come to know myself by
Yeah.
just saying things out loud. So
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it should definitely feels like they're ideal partners for some
Mhm.
good career. So now,
Yeah.
if you could name it something else, would you call it something else?
I thought about that, and like I came up with two things. It's like if I were to name it like more of a formal and clinical term, I think I thought more of like the attention variability and executive function dysregulation,
Hmm.
because I think the executive function just covers everything, including emotional, time blindness, like all of those things.
Yeah.
And it's not a deficit of anything. We just have problems regulating our impulses, our emotions, our attention, and our focus. So it's a regulation issue. But then I thought for me, it's like I always have to think of it as a fun way as well. And I thought the letters like ADHD, for me, it was always doing, hardly done, right? You're always doing something, starting stuff, but
Okay.
you can barely finish, or you finish all of it because you want to do it all.
Always
But
doing hardly done. I love that. I
yeah, or always doing, hardly dreaming too, because in my head was like, I forget about myself and the things that I want for me when everything is just focused on doing, doing, doing.
Mhm.
And most of it is for other people, and those two terms were very interchangeable, because then it can also be always dreaming and hardly doing, because we have maladaptive daydreaming. So I'm fantasizing about things and not focusing on what I'm supposed to do. So, you know, it was just very fitting. But yeah, there's definitely more things that the more I learn about it, the more I talk to clients about it, it's very different having therapy with, the neurodivergent crowd. It's like I can be more of myself. Like I'm definitely like one of those silly therapists.
I
But
know,
there's more
right?
things that I love about my ADHD. And like I don't think I will change it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think I know, and then it is amazing how kind of at home you feel with each other, where you can kind
Right.
of let your freak flag fly, and how
Hmm.
you sort of really there is that comfort level of just knowing that, like,
Yeah.
um that I guess you're not going to be judged, or I don't know what it is with that, but there's just something about like not having to mask and
Hmm.
feeling like you can uh, I guess it's the judgment, right? That there's
Right.
you don't have to come at things with shame, and then you start to realize how much you were coming at things with that
Hmm.
people pleasing element in
Yeah.
so many other conversations, so many other
Yeah.
relationships.
The
Yeah.
masking is big. And even, with clients with ADHD, it's that thing that when you self-disclose your own diagnosis, that makes the therapeutic report and just that even better and deeper, because then you know that you're going to feel understood,
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
because yeah, it's what you seek. You seek connection more than anything, because we constantly feel misunderstood. It's just a thing that happens, and I feel like having that community and that support system is like it helps you feel like okay, somebody does get me. Because if you're dealing with a lot of ADHD stuff, like who better than someone who has ADHD themselves to feel that way? But
Right.
you're also getting professional help. It's like you have the doubt. I feel sometimes like, oh my gosh, like how am I helping so many people if I can barely get my shit together some days? But you borrow each other's brains for a lot of deals. We're very good at looking outward and being intuitive, because you can sometimes sense what people need and feel, and that's what makes me good at my job. So it's definitely an interesting experience.
Yeah. No, I love to
Yeah.
hear that, because I feel like a lot of the time there can be that internalized stigma, right? Where you feel
Hmm.
like if you're open about your ADHD, you're just basically wearing a banner that says I'm a hot mess. And
Hmm.
what we really should be doing is normalizing ADHD in all professions and saying, like, this is a gift, and this is what makes me great at my job, and
Hmm.
this is why you would want to hire me, as opposed to like hire me despite my ADHD. So
Yeah,
hopefully,
exactly. Hmm.
yeah, right, hopefully these conversations are helping to um destigmatize and kind of
Hmm.
put faces to what this looks like, and I so
Right.
appreciate you willing to have these conversations and
Yeah.
share your story and be vulnerable, and I really really enjoyed
Yeah.
getting to hear more about
Yeah.
you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. We can talk for hours. You know how
I
that
know,
goes.
right? I have to be mindful of the time, because I'm like, I'm gonna have
Yes,
to
I know.
edit
I
this.
like looked at
But
it. I'm like, oh.
yeah, there were so many things that I feel like I would have loved to follow up with on you. Maybe I'll have you
Yeah.
back for another episode, because I want to hear, well, I just want to hear about all, you deal so much with trauma and
Yeah.
substance abuse too. I feel like we didn't even get to talk about that. So I'll have to have you come
Um,
back.
yeah, we can have a second episode, because I feel like those are two good topics. And also the topic of grief is a big one, that I
Yeah.
feel like it needs to be talked about. But yeah, I would love to.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, thank you, Jules. It's been so wonderful, and
absolutely.
yeah, hopefully I'll be able to check in with you again in the community, and yeah, keep
Yeah,
in
of
touch.
course. Yes, we'll do. Thank
All
you so
right,
much, Katie.
have
Take
a good
care.
day. Bye
You
bye.
too. Bye.